Hello, I am in the Newton Booth neighborhood of Midtown Sacramento. Back in the 1990s, my wife Kate and I used to rollerblade through this neighborhood. And then when I commit more seriously to my running and was running 25 miles a week, I would run through this Newton Booth neighborhood while my wife Kate would rollerblade. Today I'm thinking about a class I taught in the 1990s, and that is the T.S. Eliot class that I taught in the fall of 1999. I've talked about this class before. We were all concerned about Y2K, and we were wondering if the whole millennium would end not with a whimper, but a bang. Well, it did kind of go out with a whimper. And so we were all right on that front. One of my students in that class was Michael. Michael was an apt English major. He wrote incisive essays, and he did very well in my T.S. Eliot class. A year later, one of my colleagues in the English department fell ill just before the quarter was to begin. And I ran into the administrative assistant of the English department at that time. And I told her that if she and our department chair, Linda Morris, were in a pinch, that they could ask me to teach the class. The class was English 110A, The Principles of Literary Criticism, from Plato to Coleridge. About 5 minutes after I mentioned this, she came to my office and sat down in the chair usually reserved for students and said, "Now, Dr. Andy, why do you think you're qualified to teach this class?" Well, I mentioned all the theory classes that I had taken as a graduate student. In the year 2000, this was fall of 2000, I was only 4 years out of graduate school. All those literary theory classes that I took with Sandra Gilbert and David Van Leer and Michael Hoffman and others, they were still fresh in my memory. So I told her this, and I said, I think I would teach it this way. Back then, as now, like Odysseus, I knew how to think quickly on my feet. And I started to sketch out how the syllabus would work and what text I would use, etc., etc. Well, they were stuck. The class started in a week, and they needed someone to teach it, so they called upon me. At the beginning of the next quarter, Linda Morris told me, she called me into her office. You never want the chair of your department to call you into her office. She called me into the office, and she showed me the average student evaluations for all the classes in the English department. And then she showed me that in that class that I had taught, for the first time, where I was barely ahead of my students in the reading, she showed me that my student evaluations were higher than the average for the English department in all categories. One of my favorite student evaluations from that quarter was from a student who said, "Dr. Andy is so prepared to teach this class." That was one of the scores that I scored highest on. Was this professor prepared to teach this class? I almost got a 5.0. I was so eager to do well, and I was so filled with energy. Well, one student who noticed this was that same student, Michael, who was in my T.S. Eliot class. And in my theory class, whereas in my T.S. Eliot class, I was just starting to create websites. But a year later, I learned so much about teaching online, mostly self-taught, that not only did I create assignments where students had to write up something and add their name to it about a section of the Poetics by Aristotle, but I also posted these on the website that I created. It wasn't even in WordPress. I coded it myself with the help of Macromedia Dreamweaver. And so it was that all my students had their names attached to this assignment that was posted online. Now, Michael's last name is unusual. He's not the only person with his first and last name, but he's one of few. So, fast forward 10 years, and I get an email from Michael. He had finished his undergraduate at UC Davis. He had earned 1 or 2 graduate degrees in English. He was up for a professor job at one of the state colleges of New York. I almost told you which one, but that would have allowed you to track him down. He was, because he's still there, he was up for a job, and he emailed me out of the blue. And he said, I don't know if you remember, Dr. Andy, but I took your class 10 years ago. I said, sure, I remember, Michael. Well, I'm up for a tenure track job, but what happens if one were to Google my unusual name? One would come across that little bit of a summary and commentary on Aristotle's Poetics from an undergraduate class that I took with you in the fall of 2000. Could you please do me a favor and take that down? Now, this was still relatively early in the age of the internet. Thus, whatever you have representing your life first, back in that era, thank you, kind person, for giving me space to cross the street. Traffic is somewhat more fraught in Sacramento than along the greenbelts of Davis. But back then, when you posted something on the internet, the long tendrils of Google would find that and decide that that's the most important thing for you. And so it was with the website for English 110A, fall of the year 2000. So I said, sure, Michael, I'll take that down. Good luck with the job search. And Michael has been a tenured professor of English for these many years since. Hello. Amazing brickwork here in Midtown Sacramento. I think this neighborhood is called Poverty Ridge. Nothing impoverished about this nice house. How lucky am I that all of these impressive teachers and nurses and CEOs and tech executives and English professors in California and beyond, how lucky am I that I get to work with these students during their formative years, teaching them about writing, appreciation of literature, literary theory, critical thinking, philosophy. All of these topics were covered in my very first section of English 110A, taught at the University of California, Davis, with many great students, including Michael. I'm glad you got that job, Michael. I'm glad that my web experiment of the year 2000 did not interfere. My name is Dr. Andy. Thank you so much for tuning in to another edition of Diary of a Quizmaster. Bye-bye.